Well, good morning, folks. Another new week and happy Memorial Day. Hope you all get a chance to do something fun today and enjoy the national holiday. Hopefully, you can get a little bit of break from studying. Um, all right. Well, we've wrapped up week 2 and now moving into week 3. Week 3, a bit of a focus on ethics and accountability within a team, the unity concept. We're in the chapters in Buston that address that. As you go through those chapters, I want you to see if you can identify chapters 5 and 6 this week. See if you can identify where some of the concepts he's talking about come from. I think for those of you who've had the change and innovation class, you should be able to recognize, in particular, Kotter, the work of Kotter and what Buston's talking about. He's just relating it, Buston being he, just relating it to some particular applications as opposed to Kotter, who talks about change in general. Excuse me. So always read with a critical eye and try to determine how all this works together, how various authors are tying their work in. Keep in mind that our friend Buston here and our textbook is not scholarly. This is anecdotal. This is not based on any proper research. It's based on his experiences. So he tends, like most people writing anecdotally, tends to borrow from those who've actually done research. Unfortunately, he just doesn't give much credit where he should be, which we're all experts at now because we all know about proper citations. And once you get to the point where you've published your dissertation, folks should be citing you. All right. In this week, there's going to be a bit of a focus on corporate ethics and group governance. Buston has a certain viewpoint about it, about really where the framework for that comes from. And his is more from a British viewpoint. I'm not quite sure why that is, because he's not a British author. But in the U.S., the framework has really moved towards COSO. That's COSO. That's an acronym. And at the moment, I don't remember exactly. It's Committee on something organizations, I believe. But if you just Google COSO, you'll be able to find the COSO framework, which has really become the governing information, the governing structure for corporate governance, in particular public company governance, and the structure and responsibilities involved in all that. And again, this is part of something that's come out of the age of Enron and WorldCom and all that, and the legislation that followed. The COSO is a group of companies and folks who've come together to try to add some guidance and structure in this process. So I encourage you to Google COSO and see what that's all about. In the PowerPoints towards the end, there's also a bit of a discussion about accounting ethics, which is something I'm familiar with. Being a CPA, I am subject to those ethics. And in fact, I'm working and have been working on some research that spans a number of years about the continuing education that we're required to take in California by the Licensing Bureau, the State Board of Accountancy, and whether that really has any benefit, if there's been any change in the number of ethical violations reported over a span of years. So the majority of the ethical guidance requirements for CPAs comes through the AICPA, who is a national voluntary membership organization They have no authority in and of themselves. They can kick me out of their group, but they can't take my license. Although most states' boards of accountancy have adopted the ethics standards and policies and procedures of the AICPA as part of the statutes that govern practice of accounting in their states. So while the AICPA can't enforce it, the state can. They can certainly revoke, and they do revoke licenses for people who violate the ethics. So there's just a little bit in those videos or in the PowerPoints for this week that you'll see that talk about accounting. For those of you that aren't accountants, I don't expect you to spend much time on it, but it's just an example. There are a lot of organizations that do things like that, come up with their own codes of ethics and policies and procedures for their members to follow. So as we're working through our assignments on ethical thought, what I really want you guys to be working on is identifying the underlying ethical issue and then analyzing it. That's the essence of what ethical study is about. What's the real issue? What's the real ethical dilemma or issue? And then what's our analysis of that situation? And to do that, you've kind of got to wade through the sensationalism that tends to be around a lot of this stuff and get down to really what's going on. And ethics isn't always a simple thing. It's multi-layered. So not to necessarily pick something that could be polarizing, but one of the discussions centered around abortion this week. There are a number of layers there of ethical thought. There's ethical thought with the people involved in making the decisions of their choices. There's ethical dilemmas about government, how much the role the government should play in those kind of things, other organizations, those kind of things. So there's a number of different ethical things to consider in most situations we look at. The goal for us is get down to what the real issue is. And if you read some of the questions I ask in replies to folks' posts, that's what I was attempting to do, to get us to focus. What's the real issue here? And what's the real ethical thought process that we're going through? What's the ethical point at risk, I suppose? And that's what I really want us to focus on, because this is studying ethics is a little bit like practicing law. You have to look at the facts. You have to look at the evidence. You have to put aside hearsay, innuendo, gossip, those kind of things. What really is happening? What really are the issues? What really should we consider? And then what framework should we use? And of course, that's a bit of a rub, because there are different frameworks to use, and not everybody's always going to agree. One of the big things when we're talking about ethics and ethical decision making is who gets to make the decision? Who gets to decide what is ethical? Is it just an individual thing and we all get to go decide on our own? That would, in some cases, maybe be nice, but that probably leads more to chaos than anything else. So there has to be some kind of societal norms, and we see those. That's really where laws and statutes come from, that determine what proper behavior is in a number of areas. And we also see that governments from time to time pass legislation for our benefit. A simple one would be requiring the use of seatbelts in cars. Now, we could certainly have an ethical debate on, should the government infringe on my right to decide whether or not to wear a seatbelt? But that discussion would also have to involve, well, if I make a choice not to wear a seatbelt and something happens where I'm injured or whatever, who's responsible for that decision? And what if in getting injured, I'm taken to a hospital and I don't have the means to pay, and the government has to pay? This is the society has to pay. Do I have the right to assert my right to make an ethical decision over what the group thinks is the norm? So those are the kind of things we think about and talk about and debate. And and then finding an ethical framework to hold it against is really the challenge. How do we want to analyze this? Under what frame? So that's the charge, and it's one of the things I like most about ethics. It's really an exercise in working through these, an analysis of working through these things. A lot of ethics really is about decisions and consequences. We make decisions in life, and those decisions have consequences. I would propose that a lot of ethical violations result because people don't want to own the consequences to their decisions, and so they try to change their consequences to something that suits them a little better. So, in essence, that's what we're doing, and I want us to focus on that when we're working through these assignments, when we're doing our discussions. So along that lines, I want to make sure that when we're doing our discussions and assignments that we don't view this as a time to get on a soapbox or to grind an axe or promote a cause. And not that anybody's doing that. I just want to caution against that. It can lead to that when we're studying ethics because these become emotionally charged things we're talking about. We're really looking at analysis of the underlying issue and the ethical framework we're talking about. And we're talking about ethical framework, as I discussed in last week's post. You really need to develop and understand what your worldview is to really give you a foundation for ethical thought. Whatever your worldview is will determine how you view ethics, what you think is ethical, what you determine to be ethical, how you understand those decisions and consequences. So I want to encourage you to do that. If you've never gone through an exercise to determine your worldview, I highly recommend it. Okay, just a few things to help you along in the process on this dissertation doctorate journey. There have been some really interesting references used, and some of them have been from other cultures than our Western culture, which is fine, but we have to be aware that other cultures view leadership and ethics and these other topics we're covering very differently than we do. So if you come across studies when you're looking for your journals that are from, in particular, Asian cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, African cultures, you need to be able to show that they apply to our Western culture because the way they view life is different than we do. And I'm not sure if I've discussed this book before, but this book, Cultures and Organizations, Software of the Mind by the Hofstedes, is a seminal work that every leadership student scholar should have on their bookshelf and should consult regularly. This talks about the various differences between cultures and what you need to consider when we're looking at something on our culture and trying to generalize it to one of these other cultures, or looking at research that's happened in one of the other cultures and trying to generalize it here. There are a number of factors that are just different because of the way life happens and the way people think and act in different cultures. As an example, one of the biggest differences is the difference between individualism and collectivism. The Western world is very individualistic. We're given individual rights by our Constitution. The three cultural areas, and I realize I oversimplified Africa because it's a huge country with quite a number of cultures, some that have been westernized more than others, but that aside. So Asian cultures, the Middle Eastern cultures, generally speaking in Africa, they're called collectivist. Now, an individual puts individual rights above the community. A collectivist group puts the group above the individual. That's a huge difference in how thought happens and how right and wrong is determined. So we need to be careful when we find those things that we go through and really prove that there's that they can be generalized to our situation, our context. Typically, you have to do that by looking at the research that was actually reported on. What did they do? What were they really testing? Does it make sense that if they tested this in a collectivist society, that it might make sense in an individualistic society? And that's just one of many factors that we need to consider. So I just caution you, about research in other places. It's great to get that research and read it. Even if you can't use it, it's good because it's highly important to understand this stuff. If you're going to do anything internationally, this is vital. But the U.S. is so multicultural now, it's important. I can't imagine it's not important in most of our days. I live in California, and I actually live in a community where my kids went to high school. At their high school, 7 different languages were spoken. That represents at least 7 different cultures, not to mention microcultures within that group. If you're really interested in leading in the world today, you've got to understand these things. So I highly recommend this. I don't know if you folks will have a class that covers this. Whether you do or not, I would highly recommend this book. This is one of the most valuable books I own. It is just full of so much information that frankly I use every day. And then, as I mentioned last week, these PowerPoints, the PowerPoints are just the modality. The point of the assignment isn't to produce a presentation that you would make somewhere. You're basically doing an APA paper and just copying and pasting it onto a PowerPoint instead of just submitting Word. So APA doesn't go away. There aren't any parts of APA we don't apply. The only thing I mentioned last week is you don't have to worry about the running heads because it's just too stinking hard. But other than that, we're really just doing an APA paper and presenting it in PowerPoint format. If for no other reason to give you experience using format, which you guys probably already have plenty of experience doing. But at any rate, keep that in mind. We're after content, not graphics. You still have to do more than bullet points. I'm seeing a few things that are just bullet points. The main phrase in the instructions is this thing has to be able to stand on its own without explanation. If you just have 3 or 4 bullet points on a page, it probably doesn't stand on its own. And especially if they're all cited, it means it's your main points. I would assume you got to talk about what's in between all that, which is really your work product. But if it's not there, then we don't know. So keep that in mind. I think we have 2 more assignments that are PowerPoints, and I may change one of them just to a paper to give you more experience writing papers, because while I assume you will probably do a PowerPoint in the defense of your dissertation, you're writing a paper. Your dissertation's a paper, not a PowerPoint. So the more practice you get, the better. That's really about all I have for today. The discussions have been good. You guys really engage well. And, if you have any questions, obviously throughout the week, let me know. I think you might find this week a bit of an interesting week. Just a few resources. When we're part of the ethical discussion when we're in ethical dilemmas is, well, what do I do? Do I just do something that may violate rules or whatever? And this is a relatively recent book. It's by Ira Chaloff. Ira Chaloff wrote the book Courageous Leadership, which is about followership. So he's kind of in this book, this particular book that I'm going to show you is from 2015. So it's 4 years old now. So that means his information is 5 or 6 years old. The Courageous Follower is older than that, but his was really the first. He's kind of the seminal guy talking about followership. Up until that time, when we talked about leadership, the focus was on the leader. And Ira was one of the first guys to say, well, that's nice, but if you don't have followers, you're not a leader. What are the duties and responsibilities of followers? How does that all work together? So this is a add-on, I guess you would say, to that concept that Ira wrote about. Other people have written about it since, so there's a lot of information out there about followership. Well, a lot more than there was. Anyway, Intelligent Disobedience by Ira Chaloff. Doing right when what you're told to do is wrong. This is, I think, something that could possibly help you through that process of, well, what's the next step? We had a discussion this week about student lunches and someone giving away free lunches when it wasn't the policy. Well, this kind of helps address that. What do you do when you're in that situation? If you feel there's a moral mandate or an ethical mandate to feed that kid, what do? Do you just do it and take the consequences? Actions and consequences. You can't do something and say, "Well, I don't want to care. I don't care about the consequences." So, would you feed them and risk losing your job, or do you go to the folks you report to and say, "Hey, there's an issue, and I think this is what we need to do," and either they agree or don't agree. If they agree, not an issue anymore. The kid gets fed. If they say, "Nope, sorry, we can't do anything about that," then your choice is, well, okay, I've had my say. They've made their decision. Either I stay and follow the rules or I leave. Ira will address some of that. He does that in The Courageous Leader as well. He talks about there are times when you should just leave. I've actually been in a situation like that, and I left. It's not always a pleasant thing, but if you understand your worldview and you think you understand your ethical base, then if you don't make those decisions, what you thought your ethics were aren't really your ethics. So it can be tough, but this is an interesting resource if you're interested in that. A couple other things that I've added to my reading pile. I haven't gotten to these yet because my pile's too big. I'm doing too many other things. The Fundamentals of Ethics. This looks like a pretty decent book that will just give some very basics about ethics. And it's by Russ Schaefer Landau. I forget where he's from. He is University of Wisconsin. So this was like a relatively concise, because it's not that thick, run through of the basic of ethical thought and ethical systems that we understand today. And then at least a week or two ago, I talked about Joanne Swila and her work. She's one of the folks I really enjoy reading and following. This is one of her works. It's called Honest Work, a Business Ethics Reader. If you're interested in that, it's actually edited volume. Joanne's the lead editor, but they have a number of articles. Really, it's like a number of journal articles put together almost in class book format with questions at the end to help prompt your understanding and analysis of the articles that are given, or that in some cases are kind of like a case. So those are two of the books I've added to my pile for this summer. Just thought they might possibly be of interest, and I'll show them to you guys. Part of being a doctoral student is being curious and asking questions, in particular, why, what, how, and you should have a desire to want to solve or answer those questions. And that's done through finding things what are other people talking about, reading about, writing about? More importantly, what are people researching and publishing about? Because that shows really how people are trying to resolve our understandings of these things. So I encourage you to, when you find things that pique your attention, to build your library. There are certain things that, like absolutely Hofstede and Hofstede. If that's not in your library, your library's got a big hole in it. And even while this is getting dated, I can't imagine this will ever go out of date, because people don't change that quickly. And I think it would take something very radical to happen in the world for the things that he talks about to change. I mean, we're people, and we come from somewhere. We do things the way we do for a reason. Collectivist societies are collectivists for a reason. They have a heritage of being that way, and they value that. When you come to think about it, the individualistic societies haven't been around nearly as long. We're really kind of a new experiment in the world, relatively speaking. But still, it's a heritage, and I don't see it changing anytime soon, at least not during my lifetime. So the things that they talk about, that Hofstede and Hofstede researched and talk about, really are fairly enduring. All right. I think it's probably about all I've got to talk about. After sometime after this Zoom meeting, I'm going to do a recording and post it in the announcements. That hopefully will answer some questions about how to deal with the information you're gathering and how you're writing and how you're bringing it all together when you're using personal experience and non-scholarly information and bringing it together with the scholarly part of it all, and how all that should be fitting together, and how you should be making your conclusions and determinations based on that. It's a question that comes up a lot. How do we really do this? Because we're supposed to be citing things. So how do I cite all this stuff, and how do I make sense out of it? So I've got a couple things to do this morning, but at some point I'll get a recording posted, and hopefully that'll help answer some of the questions that some folks have. And hopefully, it's not just for this class. Hopefully, it helps you as you get farther down the path here towards your dissertation. All right, so that's about all I've got. We just have a few minutes left. So, good morning. If you have a question, I'd be happy to answer.
Well, my question seems to be what you're going to address in the recording you're going to make later on, because I'm kind of confused about the non-scholarly and scholarly, because the book that was recommended, the Boston book,
yep,
and then some of the readings that are on Canvas, you have said are not scholarly. So I'm kind of like confused about that, because if it's not scholarly, then why is it a recommendation?
Well, just because it isn't scholarly doesn't mean it doesn't have value. It's just scholarly information shouldn't be used to make your point, because we're concerned about what the facts are. The facts as we know them come from the research that's been done in the field. So, and again, as you're going through Boston, you should be able to recognize things you've seen, either if you've read through Nordhaus or you've read through Cotter. You should recognize some of those things in here. He's not thinking things up on his own. He's just relating his experiences. Or experiences are, unless you've done proper research, statistically based research, work is anecdotal, and he doesn't cite anything. He's not citing other research. Apparently, occasionally he'll talk about something, but this guy's a consultant, so he's relaying his experience. There's value in understanding what he's experienced and how he's relating it. But then as a doctoral student, we should then be saying, okay, so he says this. Is that really what's going on? Is there anything that supports this other than, what he's reporting about his life? And so I would then go do a research search and see what I could find about that topic, and see if there's actually some research that's been done that either proves or disproves what he's talking about.
And then, I get this comment from you that I'm not citing my work, and I always cite my work, but there might be something that's just common sense that, one puts together, and it's not copied from anywhere, but it seems like it is copied from somewhere. So how do you get past that?
So I will definitely address that for you in the video.
Okay.
The thing to keep in mind is I once worked with a lady from the south of the U.S. who often said common sense ain't so common. What appears to be common sense for one person isn't necessarily common sense for the next. So we just have to be careful about, and a lot of it has to do with phrasing. I'll go over that in the video to help you. We're asking you, in a lot of these discussions, we're asking you to relate your experiences. Your experiences are anecdotal. It's just exactly what Buston's doing. He's relating anecdotal experiences. So there's a way to phrase that. You need to let the reader understand where your information is coming from. So it's more about phraseology than anything else. There can't be a citation for life, right? I've lived this life. I have no citation for it. I have no reference for it. So I just need to communicate to my reader that that's what I'm talking about at that point in time. And then how I then thread that in with research that has been done is typically done with cautious language. We can't use words of magnitude like all, every, many, more, because we don't know all that. I have not talked to everyone in my life. I have not talked to most people in my life, so I can't say most people this or that. So it's using cautious language and then saying it appears, it could be, this might lead to, and that's how we do it. But I'll talk more about that in the following video that I'll post. I think that'll help you guys.
All right.
We really want to get to application, so we can't divorce the scholarly part from the anecdotal part of life, because application happens anecdotally. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in the scholarly part. The scholarly part is what's already happened, and we're trying to document it and provide some validity to it. But life happens anecdotally. So we need to be able to get to application in our life anecdotally, and we need to be able to cross between those two areas of our academics, as we're academics and scholars now. We need to be able to cross between those two parts of our life seamlessly. So hopefully this video will help you guys.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. That's about all the time we have. It's good seeing you again.
You.
Yep. Have a good week. Enjoy the holiday. Do you guys celebrate the holiday over there?
No, but next week we have a holiday. We have a week off next week.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the end of Ramadan, so we have.
Oh, yeah. Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, have a great week.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.